Fiji Women's Rights Movement, or FWRM, is a feminist women's rights organization that has at its fundamental ethos of ensuring the removal of all forms of discrimination against women in Fiji, and ensuring that there are ways in which to balance the gender equality scales. Before COVID-19, the situation for women in Fiji, is not necessarily, if we're looking at the indicators around gender equality, I have to say, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We are talking about fundamental indicators like women in leadership. Yes, we have 20% women in parliament, but however, looking across boards, and even in our parliament, we could be doing a lot better. The indicators around gender-based violence, we have very high statistics around, violence against women, through intimate and non-intimate partners, and correlating that to access to justice for women. We know that it takes women more than 2.5 years to seek justice through the formal justice sector. We're looking at more and more young women come out through tertiary educations, but this has not meant women having quality jobs. So that as a backdrop, we're talking about lack of decision-making opportunities. We're talking about lack of, potential to own property and businesses, etc. We're talking about economics and the role that women play, and the under-recognition of the care work, the unpaid care work that women do. Now, when we put that and juxtapose that with the COVID-19 pandemic situation, we find that all of those areas are, where women's lives intersect. The situation becomes worse off. It is exacerbated, and that is what we are finding ourselves, in right at this moment, where we see that, because of the restrictions on mobility through lockdowns and curfews, because of the way the virus spreads, women are locked in with perpetrators of violence. How do they access services through the formal justice sector when they need, help urgently? This is where we have seen the helplines, the national helplines, come into, provide the services needed. We see, and we've heard conservative estimates of 120,000 people in Fiji having lost their jobs. And this equates to almost half of the working population in Fiji. Majority of these are women. So we now have a large cohort of women from the tourism sector, from the informal industries, who are without basic income. These are the very same women who are also outside of the social protection and social security mechanisms. So we're talking about insurance. We're talking about having provident funds, pension schemes. Savings in the banks, and having cash transfers given to them. They're not party to that. They are sort of outside the system. So we have a growing number of group of women who we say having lost their employment, are part of in the growing number of poor women in Fiji. And their livelihoods are at risk.
Hi, I'm Virisila Buadromo. I'm one of the co-leads at the Urgent Action Fund Asia and the Pacific. We're a rapid response crimes makers supporting women and non-binary human rights defenders in Asia and the Pacific. The impact of COVID on women and non-binary human rights defenders or activists, both in Asia and the Pacific, has been huge, like it has been in the rest of the world. And the reason being is because the pandemic has purely just amplified or exacerbated the inequalities that currently exist. So the inequalities that are experienced by women, say, around violence, which is an impact of inequality, is violence. So there's been an increase in violence. When you look at the people who are at the forefront of addressing COVID-19, for whether they're essential workers like health workers, or whether they are women who are, or people who are working in essential services like supermarkets, they're mainly women. So they are also impacted by the virus themselves. Therefore, there's also high infection rates, and in some cases, deaths in a lot of countries. And this impact, I think, has a far-reaching impact, rather than just the present, but I can see it extending past the pandemic itself, is the economic impact that it has on women. A lot of the sectors which is dominated by women and non-binary sectors, many of them are in informal sectors that have very poor to no social security, don't exist. So a lot of these women and non-binary human rights defenders currently have no economic security. So in terms of what we, Urgent Action Fund, are doing at the moment to support activists, both women and non-binary defenders, is we created a grant specifically for these communities, because we are seeing that these communities are not accessing or have no access to government subsidies or government support. They're for some reason falling through the cracks, purely for their identity or the kind of work that they do, or they live in areas that have absolutely no access to government support. So our grants have been able to support from economics, support them in economic security and livelihood, to medicines, to shelter. So these are some of the things that we've been able to support. To date, like we opened up our grant in April the 6th, till now we've given out already about $130,000 US dollars has already gone to supporting specifically COVID grants, but also the impact of COVID. Because the other impact is a lot of the defenders are getting surveillance, and a lot of their human rights are being limited, and they're using the pandemic to do that. So we're doing a lot of security and well-being grants too. Some of the amazing things that we're seeing with our COVID grants is that activists are not just responding to their most immediate needs, which is just about survival. And for a lot of these activists, the act of survival is actually resistance in itself, and that's a political act, and I think that's pretty amazing. But they're also doing, taking the grant and investing in things, so for example, like community gardens, which are focused on growing plants and food indigenous to that community, because they're seeing this as an opportunity to be able to start and focus on food sovereignty. And I think that this idea of looking at new ways of working that's not only centered on people, planet, and other beings, but the interdependence of that is, for me, like a new way of working, and it's a new way of creating new systems. And that's what this pandemic is saying. It's like Arundhati Roy basically said, that the pandemic is a portal by which we can take forward new ideas and leave behind ideas that don't support people, planet, and other beings. And I think that a lot of activists on the ground now are seeing this as an opportunity and using the grants that we've given them to be able to recreate new ways of engaging and being.
Hi, my name is Reddy and I work for the Fiji Women's Fund. The Fiji Women's Fund is an initiative of the Australian government through its program called Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development. We are a 5-year program, and our mandate is to support women's groups, networks, and organizations in Fiji to achieve and transform gender equality in Fiji. The main role of women's funds across the world, so women's funds have been around, and one of the oldest women's funds is Mama Cash, Global Fund for Women. The way that women's funds work or function is really to be the resourcing arm of the women's movement. So our key mandate is for us to be able to influence and transform philanthropy and increase resources for women and girls. And in our case, to increase resources for women and girls in Fiji. And when we talk about resource mobilization, we talk about resources in its all entirety. So we're talking about financial resources and non-financial resources. Non-financial resources can include skills, knowledge, networks, and relationships. So in the Fiji Women's Fund, that's what we try and do. So one part of our role is to mobilize resources and at the same time to support our grantee partners. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have worked quite closely with our grantee partners in, trying to understand their experiences, what are some strategies that they're using within their communities to support the work that they're doing, what are some challenges as well that they're experiencing so that we are able to amplify those experiences. In Fiji's case, at the moment, we are a COVID-free country, but a couple of months ago, that was not the case. And what made the pandemic more difficult to survive through is that Fiji also experienced a tropical cyclone, which was TC Harold. So alongside the pandemic, we also had a natural disaster. And so what we were hearing from our grantee partners is that whilst they were trying to increase knowledge and awareness around how to better prepare for COVID-19, they also had to go through recovery activities. So we had a lot of communities lose their source of income. There was a lot of flooding. And so a lot of women's organizations and networks that we work with really had to rethink their projects. And so we had a lot of partners ask us for a no-cost extension, which is, give us time to work out what strategies that help us, but also give us support in terms of how we can work remotely. So for a lot of our partners, one of the challenges that they faced was around resourcing organizational core heads. And so for us, the women's movement is nothing without strong, resilient women's networks and organizations. And for them to be resilient, it's really important as women's funds to provide that flexibility and to be an empathetic funder and a partner. In a pandemic where things may not necessarily seem like we figured it all out, because it's quite new for us and quite different. And so a lot of the groups that we are working with are trying to figure that out as they work alongside their communities. Women's rights around the world are challenged, but when you look at women in the Pacific, their lived experiences are far more challenging because of the intersecting challenges that they face. And most often, when you look at women in the Pacific, their voices are often invisible. And so if spaces such as the WOW Global space is a really important one because it's a space that we can amplify Pacific women's voices. So if you are keen and support women's rights, support Pacific women and girls and trans people's rights by supporting the Pacific Feminist Fund and the Fiji Women's Fund. Pinaka.